Three men beat up the mob boss in an alley until a woman saves him with her secret skill. Comment what you thought of this story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and tell me which city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story and get to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The Chicago dawn had that characteristic smell of wet asphalt mixed with the exhaust from the few cars still roaming the deserted streets of Wicker Park. Emily Carter adjusted the sports backpack on her shoulders, feeling the pleasant weight of fatigue taking over her muscles after another intense workout. The handball swayed, clipped to the side of her pack, an inseparable companion on her lonely early mornings. At 24, she had learned that dreams came at a high price, paid in discipline, sweat, and sacrifice. As she walked through the empty streets toward the bus stop that would take her back to the south side, her thoughts drifted between worrying about the overdue electric bill and hoping to get a few more clients at the physical therapy clinic where she worked. Fog was beginning to form on the street corners, creating diffuse halos around the streetlights. Emily zipped her hoodie up to her chin, trying to shield herself from the damp cold that seemed to seep into her bones. Her legs still burned from the last resistance exercise she'd done on the empty court at the club, those endless sprints her coach insisted were necessary to improve her explosive power. She could feel every muscle fiber protesting, but it was a good pain, the kind of pain that meant progress, growth, overcoming. The alley appeared on her left like an open wound between two old buildings, poorly lit by a flickering streetlight. Emily almost paid no attention, accustomed to the grim landscapes of that area, transitioning from the bohemian neighborhood to an abandoned industrial zone. But then she heard the sounds, muffled groans, the dull impact of fists against flesh, the shuffling of feet on the wet ground. Her heart raced. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to keep going, not to get involved, to think of the mother who depended on her, the career she had fought so hard to build. But there was something stronger than fear, a compulsion that came from long ago, maybe from the time she defended smaller classmates in school, maybe from a deep-seated need to make a difference in a world that so often seemed too unfair. Emily paused for a moment, her hands trembling as she gripped the straps of her backpack. Logic told her to call the police, not to risk it, to remember she had responsibilities, people who depended on her. But then she heard another cry, this time more desperate, and something inside her broke. She thought of her father, of how no one had helped when he needed it, of how he died alone on that dirty street, while dozens of people hurried by, looking the other way. No, she wouldn't be another person who pretended not to see. When she peeked into the alley, the scene was even worse than she had imagined. 3 hooded men surrounded a figure, slumped on the ground, their coordinated and brutal kicks revealing professional training. The victim tried to protect himself uselessly, his expensive suit torn and stained with blood. There was something methodical about the violence, something cold and calculated that made her feel a visceral dread. These were not common muggers. They were enforcers, and she was about to get involved in something much bigger than she could imagine. Emily didn't think. Her athletic instincts took over. She ripped the ball from her backpack, felt the familiar weight in her hands, calculated the distance and angle as she had done thousands of times on the court, and threw it with all the force her trained muscles could muster. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. She saw the ball cut through the air in a perfect arc, felt the burn in her shoulder from the maximum effort, and heard the satisfying thud of impact as the ball hit the nearest attacker squarely in the face. He fell backward like a disjointed puppet, screaming in pain and surprise, his hands flying to his probably broken nose. The chaos that followed was a blur of shouts and movements. The other 2 men turned to her, and Emily saw surprise give way to fury in their eyes. But she was already running toward the fallen man, adrenaline burning through her veins like liquid fire. She grabbed him by the arms, surprised by his weight, and pulled him with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He was heavy, but the adrenaline gave her superhuman energy. As the other two attackers recovered from the shock, shouting orders to each other, she dragged the victim through an opening in the side of an old textile factory, plunging into the shadows of the abandoned interior. The smell of mold and old chemicals assaulted her nostrils as soon as they entered the building. Her legs burned as she ran between rusted machines and piles of moldy fabric, the man stumbling beside her, leaning on her to stay upright. She could hear their pursuers entering behind them, their heavy boots echoing on the cracked concrete. Emily pulled the man left, then right, using the shadows and abandoned equipment as cover. Her years of playing handball having taught her to think quickly, to anticipate movements, to find angles others wouldn't see. When they finally stopped, hidden behind a giant dust-covered loom, Emily allowed herself to really look at the man she had saved. Even in the dark, even with his face bloodied and swollen, there was something about him that made her hold her breath. Dark, penetrating eyes studied her with an intensity that seemed to pierce right through her, and despite his injuries, he maintained an erect, almost regal posture. There was power in that man, she could feel it, an authority that emanated from him like a magnetic field. Her eyes quickly scanned his face, noting the strong jawline even beneath the bruises, the large hands that gripped her arm with surprising force for someone who had just been brutally beaten. The silence between them was charged, punctuated only by their heavy breathing and the distant sounds of their pursuers searching other corners of the building. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine when his eyes met hers. There was something there, an intensity, a recognition, as if he were seeing through all her carefully constructed defenses, straight to the core of who she was. Julian Thorne had never experienced genuine surprise in his adult life. He anticipated betrayals, planned for contingencies, controlled variables. But this woman staring at him with frightened but determined eyes, who had risked her own life to save a complete stranger, was something entirely outside his calculated universe. There was a purity in her features, in the way her panting breath moved her chest under the worn-out workout clothes, in the genuine concern that shone in her brown eyes as she moved closer to examine his injuries. He had spent 20 years surrounded by people who acted out of self-interest, fear, or ambition, but this woman, this brave and seemingly insane stranger, had acted out of pure goodness, and that completely disarmed him. She smelled of clean sweat and inexpensive soap, so different from the expensive, artificial perfumes of the women in his circle. There were calluses on her hands when she hesitantly raised them toward his face, marks of hard work and dedication. Julian found himself mesmerized by the way her lips parted slightly as she assessed his injuries, by the genuine worry that creased her brow. Emily extended a trembling hand to touch the cut above his eyebrow, and it was as if the entire world stood still. Her skin was cold from the shock, but her fingers were surprisingly delicate as they touched Julian's bruised face. He captured that small hand in his, staining it with blood, and something fundamental shifted in the air between them. Emily felt an electric shock run up her arm from the point where their skin touched. It was crazy, she knew. It was adrenaline and fear and confusion, but there was something more, something that made her want to move closer instead of pulling away. Logic no longer had a place in that dark warehouse. When their lips met, it was with an urgency that came from a primal place, a need that transcended all reasoning. The kiss was desperate, charged with the adrenaline of their recent escape from violence, but also with something deeper, an instant connection that neither of them could comprehend or resist. Julian pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pressed against her waist, and Emily responded with equal fervor, her fingers clutching his torn shirt as if it were the only real thing in a world that had lost all meaning. She could taste the blood on his mouth, but also something else, something warm and alive and intense. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could feel it against his own chest. The world around them completely disappeared in that moment. There were no more pursuers, no more danger. There was only the heat of that kiss, the way his hands held her as if she were something precious and fragile at the same time. Julian's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, while Emily clung to his shoulders as if they were the only solid thing in a world that suddenly made no sense. It was the discreet glow of his watch that broke the spell, a flash of blue light pulsing insistently in the dark. Julian pulled away reluctantly, his forehead resting against hers for a prolonged moment, their breaths still in sync, before he finally looked at the device and triggered something on its face. Within minutes, the silence of the warehouse was broken by the sound of heavy vehicles stopping outside and coordinated footsteps invading the space. Emily heard voices shouting commands, the sound of weapons being cocked, and suddenly the warehouse was full of armed men, all moving with military precision. Emily recoiled instinctively when she saw the armed men, all dressed in impeccable suits despite the hour, all treating the bloodied man beside her with a reverence that sent a chill down her spine. One of them, older, with graying hair and scars on his face, approached with a first aid kit and began treating Julian's wounds with an efficiency that revealed years of practice. The words he used confirmed Emily's worst fears. Boss, Mr. Thorne, the outfit. She had saved a criminal. The horror must have been visible on her face because Julian raised a hand, cutting the older man off mid-sentence. His eyes found hers again, and there was something vulnerable in that look, something that completely contradicted the absolute authority with which he commanded these dangerous men. Emily saw the shift in him, the way the mask of absolute power slid back into place, transforming the man who had kissed her so passionately into something colder, more controlled. But his eyes still held hers, still pleaded for understanding. He ordered that no one touch her, that she be allowed to leave safely, that they ensure she got home without being followed by the men who had attacked him. His voice was firm, filled with an undisputed authority that made every man around him straighten up immediately. But before she could leave, he gently held her wrist, his thumb tracing circles on her skin in a way that made Emily's heart race again. "Don't forget me," he said simply, and there was so much weight in those 3 words that Emily felt as if she had just made a promise she didn't intend to make. She left that warehouse in a black SUV with tinted windows, flanked by silent men who dropped her off at the door of her modest apartment on the south side, as if they were royal guards escorting a princess. Her mother was asleep in the small bedroom next door, oblivious to the fact that her daughter's life had changed irrevocably that morning. The weeks that followed were the most confusing of Emily's life. She tried to go back to her normal routine, waking up early to train, going to the clinic, taking care of her mother, studying for her specialization. But everything had changed. There were subtle shifts that left her uneasy. The scholarship she had lost due to a bureaucratic issue was miraculously reinstated with a formal apology from the university. The clinic where she worked, which was on the verge of closing due to permit issues, suddenly had all its paperwork approved in record time. Her mother received a job offer from a corporate cleaning company that paid 3 times her current salary, with benefits that seemed too good to be true. Each of these changes came with plausible explanations. Official documents, polite people explaining it, had all been a simple administrative error, a policy review, a happy coincidence. But Emily wasn't naive. She recognized the invisible hand behind it all, could feel his influence in every carefully orchestrated detail. Emily wasn't naive. She knew who was behind it all. And the most disturbing part was that, despite all her moral upbringing, despite all her principles, she couldn't feel just indignation. There was gratitude too, and worse, there was a dangerous hope that he would show up again. She found herself glancing at the clinic door whenever the bell rang, her heart leaping at the possibility of seeing those dark eyes again. At night, alone in her small room, she replayed that kiss in the abandoned warehouse, the feeling of his hands in her hair, the intensity of that moment that seemed to have burned a permanent mark on her soul. She tried to focus on her patients during the day, but her thoughts always wandered back to him. Did he think of her too? Had that kiss meant something, or was it just the result of adrenaline and danger? She would find herself touching her own lips distractedly, remembering his taste, the way he had held her as if she were something precious. Julian was also fighting his own demons. He had built his life on absolute control, on never allowing emotions to interfere with strategic decisions. But that woman, with her honest eyes and reckless courage, had awakened something in him he thought had been dead since he was 15. Since the day he watched his own father be executed in front of him, he found himself investigating every detail of her life, not with the coldness with which he investigated enemies or business partners, but with a genuine hunger to know her. He discovered that she woke up at 4 in the morning to train, that she dreamed of working with professional athletes, that she had been supporting her mother alone since she was 19, that she'd never had a serious relationship because she didn't trust men since her father died under suspicious circumstances when she was 15. Every detail he learned about her only fueled his obsession. He found himself imagining what it would be like to wake up next to her every morning, to watch her train, to hear her stories about the clinic's patients. That last detail made Julian pause. He ordered a discreet investigation and discovered something that made him feel a devastating guilt for the first time in years. Emily's father had been killed in a shootout related to a turf war between criminal organizations. And although it hadn't been directly ordered by Julian, who at the time was only 26 and consolidating his power, it had been a consequence of the violent world he helped perpetuate. He knew he should stay away from her, that it was the right thing to do. But the need to see her again was stronger than any moral consideration. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. He read the report 3 times, each time feeling the guilt deepen. John Carter, physical therapist, 42 years old, killed by a stray bullet during a territorial clash. The date was exactly 9 years ago, during a particularly violent period of his rise to power. Julian remembered that period. The orders he had given, the men he had lost, the lives he had destroyed without a second thought. And now he discovered that one of those lives had left a daughter who had saved him without knowing he represented the very type of violence that had destroyed her family. The reunion happened 3 weeks after that fateful morning. Julian walked into the clinic where she worked using a fake name, claiming back pain that needed urgent physical therapy. When Emily entered the treatment room and saw him there, sitting on the exam table with that dangerous half-smile, she was completely paralyzed. All the anger she had cultivated, all the determination to confront him about the interference in her life, evaporated under the weight of that intense gaze. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Emily just stared at him, her heart beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. Julian drank in the sight of her with hungry eyes, noticing every detail, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, the white coat over her work clothes, the pen tucked behind her ear, the faint, dark circles that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well these past few weeks either. "Are you really hurt, or is this just an excuse?" she finally asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she approached professionally, placing her hands on his shoulders to assess his muscles. Her hands trembled slightly as they touched him, and she knew he noticed. Julian took one of her hands and pressed it against his chest, where she could feel the rapid beat of his heart through his expensive shirt. "I'm hurt in other ways," he answered with a brutal honesty that caught her completely off guard. "You hurt me when you showed me there's still genuine goodness in this rotten world I live in. Emily should have walked out of that room. She should have called security, should have ignored the vulnerability she saw in those dark eyes, should have remembered all her principles and values. But instead, she found herself sitting next to him on the table, and for the first time since that morning, they truly talked. Julian told her about the father who was murdered, about how at 15 he was forced to witness it, and then, years later, to take control of an empire he never asked to inherit. His voice grew hoarse as he described that day, how he had come home from school to find strange men in his house, how they forced him to watch as they methodically executed his father. Each shot a warning to others who might consider challenging the established order. He spoke of the mother who now lived in a convent, unable to cope with the violence that destroyed her family, of the younger sister he sent to study in Europe to keep her away from that world. Emily, in turn, spoke of the father she lost, of how she discovered years later he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, of how that shaped her fierce desire to live a clean, honest life, far from anything that could bring suffering. Her voice broke as she described identifying the body, how her mother had collapsed and couldn't work for months, how she had taken on adult responsibilities at 15 because there was no other choice. She didn't tell Julian she knew who he was, that she had done her own discreet investigation in the first sleepless nights after that morning, that she had discovered he was known as one of the most dangerous men in Chicago. But there was a mutual understanding between them, a recognition that both were products of a violent world that had left deep scars. The conversation stretched on for hours. Emily's other patients were rescheduled by her colleague, who peeked through the door once, saw the intensity of the conversation, and decided not to interrupt. They talked about things they had never shared with anyone, fears and dreams and regrets. Julian described how every decision he made carried the weight of lives, how he had become so good at compartmentalizing that he sometimes forgot what it was to feel something genuine. Emily admitted that she sometimes felt suffocated by responsibility, that she was afraid she would never achieve her dreams because she was so busy just surviving. When Julian finally stood up to leave, it was already getting dark outside. He stopped at the door and turned to her. "I'm getting out of this," he said, and she could hear the determination in his voice. "I'm going to find a way to leave this world behind. But I need to know if, when I do, if I become someone you could respect, you would give me a chance." Emily knew she should say no. She knew she was playing with fire, that getting involved with a man like Julian was an invitation to disaster. But when she looked into those eyes and saw the genuine hope there, something that probably no one else saw, she found herself saying, "Show me it's possible to change, and maybe I'll believe it." The months that followed were a dangerous dance between two worlds that should never have touched. Julian began to carefully dismantle his criminal empire, transferring legitimate operations, cutting ties with violent partners, using his resources to build clean businesses. But the process was slow and treacherous because leaving organized crime wasn't like quitting a normal job. Every move had to be calculated, every decision weighed against the possibility of retaliation. He spent sleepless nights planning his exit, consulting with lawyers specializing in financial crimes, moving money through legitimate channels, setting up front companies that would eventually become real businesses. Every step was risky. Partners started asking questions, questioning his dedication, suggesting he was getting soft. He had to be more brutal than ever in some situations to keep up appearances. And those nights were the worst, when he had to reconcile the man he was trying to become with the man he still needed to be. Meanwhile, he saw Emily whenever he could, secret meetings in discreet cafes, walks through Lincoln Park while the city was still asleep, conversations that lasted for hours about everything and nothing. They discussed philosophy and politics, shared childhood stories, laughed at silly jokes. Emily showed him the world that existed beyond violence, taking him to art galleries in hidden alleys, to modest restaurants with delicious food, to parks where children played without fear. And slowly, Julian began to see the possibility of a different life. Emily found herself being pulled deeper and deeper into his world, even as Julian tried to protect her. She met his sister, Sophia, a 22-year-old architecture student who had returned to the States to visit her brother and was immediately fascinated by Emily. Sophia saw in her exactly what Julian saw, someone genuine, strong, capable of making her brother smile in a way she hadn't seen in years. The two women formed an unlikely friendship, and through Sophia, Emily began to better understand the complex man she was falling for. Sophia told stories about the brother Julian would never share, about how he had cared for her after their mother's breakdown, how he secretly attended her ballet recitals when she was a child, always sitting in the back of the theater, always leaving before she could see him, about how he anonymously funded a drug rehabilitation clinic after one of his childhood friends died of an overdose. Emily began to see the layers of complexity in this dangerous man, the kindness he desperately tried to hide under a facade of brutality. But the romance blooming between Emily and Julian did not go unnoticed. Julian's rivals, seeing him pull away from the business, began to investigate why. When they discovered Emily, they saw a perfect opportunity. At the same time, a federal prosecutor named Agent Miller, who had been investigating Julian's activities for years, began to notice the strange patterns in his finances. Miller was an idealist, someone who genuinely believed he could clean up Chicago's organized crime. When he discovered the connection between Julian and Emily, he saw a potential informant. The pressure began to mount from all sides. Miller showed up at Emily's clinic, introducing himself politely, but making it clear he knew about her meetings with Julian. He didn't threaten her directly, but the implication was there. She could cooperate voluntarily, or she could be dragged into an investigation that would destroy her career and possibly put her mother at risk. Emily felt her world crumbling. She had no useful information to give Miller, even if she wanted to, because Julian carefully kept her away from the details of his business. But the mere existence of that pressure made her question everything. When she told Julian about Miller's visit, his reaction was a mixture of controlled fury and genuine fear. Fear not for himself, but for her. He knew that having Emily in his life put her in constant danger, and the guilt he felt was almost unbearable. But when he tried to push her away, claiming it was to protect her, Emily reacted with a strength that surprised them both. She had spent her entire life being strong for everyone else, taking care of her mother, building her career against all odds, standing firm when the world tried to knock her down. And now that she had finally found someone who truly saw her, who challenged and inspired her, she wasn't going to give up without a fight. "We face this together," she told him, her hands holding his face, forcing him to look into her eyes. "You don't protect me by pushing me away. You protect me by trusting me, by letting me in, by allowing me to be strong for you too." Julian, who had spent 20 years learning to trust no one, who had built walls so high around his heart he thought them impenetrable, felt those walls crumble under the weight of that simple declaration. Emily's transformation from someone who always followed the rules to someone willing to challenge them for love was gradual but profound. She began to understand that morality wasn't as simple as she had believed, that sometimes good people made bad choices for understandable reasons, that the world wasn't divided into heroes and villains. Julian was trying to change, was making enormous sacrifices to build a different life, and she could choose to abandon him in that process or stand by his side. The conflict came to a head when Emily was kidnapped. She was leaving the clinic late one night when a black van pulled up beside her and masked men dragged her inside. The terror she felt in those first moments was absolute, but it quickly gave way to a cold anger. Her kidnappers, associates of a rival of Julian's named Vincent Gallo, made the mistake of underestimating her. They saw a slender physical therapist and assumed she'd be an easy victim. They didn't count on years of athletic training that had given her quick reflexes and surprising strength. Emily forced herself to breathe calmly, to assess the situation rationally, despite the panic that threatened to consume her. She counted the men, 5 in total, observed their movement patterns, looked for weaknesses. As they tied her to a chair in the dark warehouse, she discreetly worked on the knots while they discussed how to use her to make Julian fold. Every word she heard fueled her determination. She would not be used as a tool against him. She would not allow it. When Julian received the video from the kidnappers demanding he turn over territories and businesses in exchange for Emily's life, something in him broke completely. For the first time since taking over the outfit, he acted not with calculated coldness, but with an emotional fury that frightened even his most loyal men. He mobilized every resource he had, called in favors from people he hadn't spoken to in years, and turned Chicago into a battlefield in a matter of hours. The rescue operation was both brutal and surgical. Julian personally led the raid on the warehouse where Emily was being held, and what followed was a visceral demonstration of why he was feared throughout the American underworld. But when he finally reached the room where she was, he found a scene he would never forget. Emily had managed to free herself using techniques she had learned in self-defense classes and the strength of her trained muscles. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, her clothes torn. But she was on her feet, holding a piece of pipe like a weapon, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. Seeing her like that, wounded but not broken, fighting for her own freedom, changed something fundamental in Julian. He realized that Emily didn't need to be protected like a fragile princess in a tower. She was a warrior in her own right, shaped by her own battles, and what she needed wasn't a savior but a partner who would fight alongside her. When they embraced in that blood-soaked warehouse, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies, it was as if they finally completely understood each other. But the battle wasn't over. Vincent Gallo escaped and swore revenge, and Agent Miller used the shootout as justification to intensify his investigation. Julian and Emily found themselves in an impossible situation, surrounded on all sides, with no obvious options. It was then that Emily suggested something radical. What if, instead of running or fighting, they faced everything head-on? What if Julian cooperated fully with the authorities, turning over information about the organization in exchange for immunity, and used his fortune to build something new? The idea was extremely risky. It meant betraying people who had trusted him, even if they were criminals. It meant putting not only his life, but Emily's at risk as well. But there was a ruthless logic to it. And the more they discussed it, the more Julian saw it as perhaps the only real way out. With the help of a high-powered lawyer specializing in plea bargains, they began to structure a plan. The process took months of tense negotiations, secret meetings, and meticulous preparation. Julian had to make brutally difficult decisions, choosing what information to reveal, which operations to dismantle, how to protect the few people in his organization he genuinely cared about. Emily was by his side every step of the way, even when her family started asking difficult questions about the changes in her life, even when she had to lie to her mother about where she was spending so much time. Emily's mother, Eleanor, was no fool. She saw the changes in her daughter, the way she seemed burdened by worries she wouldn't share, the whispered phone calls late at night, the days she came home with deep-set dark circles and hands trembling with tension. When she finally confronted Emily, demanding the truth, the young woman found herself doing something she never imagined she would, lying directly to the person she loved most in the world. She told her mother a sanitized version of the truth, that she was seeing someone complicated, someone with a difficult past who was trying to change. Eleanor, who had raised her daughter alone after losing her husband to urban violence, recognized the look in Emily's eyes. It was the same determined look she'd seen in the mirror years ago, when she decided she would build a better life for her daughter, no matter the cost. She held her daughter's hands in hers, calloused from years of hard work, and said simply, "Just promise me you know what you're doing, because I can't lose you too." The day of the official testimony was tense beyond description. Julian sat in an interrogation room with Miller and a team of federal prosecutors, with Emily waiting outside under police protection. For 12 hours, he detailed operations, revealed structures, named names. Every word was a betrayal of a code he had lived by for 20 years, but it was also a step toward freedom. When he finally walked out of that room, exhausted but relieved, Emily was there waiting, and the hug they shared was filled with an emotion neither of them could fully name. But the real ordeal was yet to come. Julian's testimony triggered a wave of arrests and retaliations. Threats were made, contracts were put on his head and Emily's. They had to live under police protection for months, constantly moving between safe houses, living with the constant paranoia that every stranger could be an assassin. It was in this period of extreme pressure that their relationship was truly tested. There were nights when Emily woke up screaming from nightmares, reliving the kidnapping, imagining worse scenarios. There were nights when Julian stayed awake watching the door with a gun, unable to trust the security promised by the police after years of learning the only person he could trust was himself. There were nights when they both wondered if they had made the right choice, if love was worth all this suffering. But there were also moments of profound tenderness in these dark days, nights when they held each other in the darkness and found comfort in the simple presence of one another. Mornings when they woke up intertwined, and for a few precious seconds before reality returned, just existed together in peace. Whispered conversations about the future they would build when this was all over. Shared dreams of a simple, honest life far from all the violence. Julian's sister, Sophia, was crucial during this period. She returned to the States against all advice, refusing to let her brother face this alone. Her presence brought a necessary lightness to the dark days, and her friendship with Emily deepened into something akin to sisterhood. It was Sophia who suggested that, when it was all over, they should start over somewhere new, far from Chicago and all the painful memories. The turning point came unexpectedly. One of Julian's former partners, a man named Marcus Riley, who ran operations at the Port of Chicago, decided to follow his example. Inspired by the courage he saw in Julian, Marcus also sought a plea deal, and after him came others. Like a domino effect, the organization Julian had once commanded began to dismantle itself from within. Vincent Gallo, isolated and betrayed on all sides, made the fatal mistake of attempting a direct attack on Emily in broad daylight. He was killed by the police during the attempt, and his death marked the end of the most dangerous phase. Gradually, life began to normalize, or at least to find a new normal. Julian had to surrender most of his fortune as part of the deal, keeping only enough to start over honestly. He and Emily, along with Sophia, moved to San Diego, a coastal city far enough from Chicago to offer a new beginning, but close enough that Emily could visit her mother regularly. Eleanor, who had finally learned the full truth from Miller, surprised everyone by supporting her daughter's decision. She saw in Julian a man who had made terrible choices but was genuinely trying to redeem himself, and that was more than could be said for many men she had known. In San Diego, Julian used his business acumen to open a series of legitimate restaurants that quickly gained popularity for their genuine quality of food and service. He discovered a deep satisfaction in building something through honest work. in seeing happy people enjoy something he created without coercion or violence. Emily, for her part, secured a position as the physical therapist for the city's beach volleyball team, finally realizing her dream of working with professional athletes. Sophia enrolled at the local university to finish her architecture degree and fell in love with the city and its more relaxed pace of life. The wedding took place a year after the move, a simple ceremony on the beach at sunset, with only close family and a few select friends. Agent Miller attended, no longer as a prosecutor, but as someone who had witnessed the genuine transformation of two people and wanted to celebrate it. Eleanor cried throughout the ceremony, not from sadness, but from a deep relief at seeing her daughter finally happy, truly happy, in a way she had never seen before. The life they built together was not perfect. There were days when the past came back to haunt them, when Julian woke up sweating from nightmares about the things he had done, or when Emily caught herself looking over her shoulder even though she knew she was safe. There were scars, physical and emotional, that would never completely disappear. But there was also a peace that neither of them thought they would ever find. There were mornings when they woke up tangled in bed, with a view of the ocean, the sound of the waves mixing with the song of birds. There were nights they dined at Julian's restaurants, watching the happy customers and wondering how they had gotten here. There were moments of deep intimacy when they looked at each other and saw not just love, but a mutual gratitude for having saved one another from destinies that had seemed inevitable. Emily continued to play handball, now on a local recreational team, and Julian sometimes went to watch her games, marveling at the grace and strength she displayed on the court. He would think back to that night in Chicago when she threw the ball that saved his life, and wonder if somehow fate had conspired to bring them together, if all the suffering and violence they had both experienced was necessary to shape them into the people they needed to be, to find each other. Sophia eventually married a local surfer and had a daughter she named Emily, in honor of the sister-in-law who had become like a sister to her. Eleanor moved to San Diego too, unable to resist the pull of being near her daughter and the grandchild that was still to come, because Emily was pregnant, carrying within her the physical proof that love can blossom in the most unlikely of places, that redemption is possible even for those who believe they are beyond it. On quiet nights, Julian and Emily would walk hand in hand on the beach, watching the stars over the ocean, and talk about everything they had been through to get there. They spoke of the choices they made, the ones they regretted, and the ones they would make again without hesitation. They talked about the future, about the child on the way, about the restaurants Julian wanted to open, about the athletes Emily dreamed of training, but mostly they just existed together, two survivors who found in each other not just romantic love, but something much deeper. A partnership forged in the fires of adversity, a mutual understanding that transcended words. Their story was not a fairy tale. There was no prince charming or damsel in distress waiting to be rescued. It was something more real, and for that reason, more powerful. It was about two imperfect people scarred by life who refused to let their scars define their futures. It was about choosing love even when logic said to run away, about believing in the possibility of change even when the whole world said it was impossible. It was about courage, not the kind that manifests in grand gestures, but the kind shown in small daily decisions to choose hope over cynicism, trust over fear. When their son was born, a boy they named Peter in honor of Emily's father, Julian held that small, perfect life in his arms and made a silent promise. He promised that his son would grow up knowing only the father he had become, not the man he had been. He promised he would build a legacy of honesty and hard work, that he would prove that the past does not determine the future. And when he looked at Emily, exhausted but radiant in the hospital bed, he saw reflected in her eyes the same fierce determination that had made her throw that ball on that fateful morning in Chicago. Because in the end, that's what it was all about. Not about escaping the past completely, because the scars would always remain, but about consciously choosing what kind of future to build despite them. Emily had saved Julian's life that night, not just physically, but in a much more fundamental way. She had shown him there was still goodness in the world, that there was still something worth fighting for beyond power and survival. And Julian, in turn, had saved Emily from a life of just surviving, showing her that she deserved to live fully, to love completely, to risk everything for something worthwhile. Years later, when they told their story to close friends, they always left out the darkest details, the parts that still hurt too much to revisit, but the essence remained clear. They were two people who found each other at the most unlikely moment, in the most unlikely place, and against all odds built something beautiful and lasting from the ruins of their former lives. They were living proof that true love isn't about perfection or ease, but about choosing to stay, choosing to fight, choosing to believe even when all seems lost. And when Emily watched Julian playing with Peter in the sand, building castles that the sea would inevitably destroy, but which they would rebuild together, again and again, she thought of that sentence he had said to her in the clinic all those years ago. "I'm going to find a way out of this," he had promised. And he had. Not in the ways she had imagined, not without pain and sacrifice, but he had found a way. They had found a way together, and that made all the difference. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story, giving it a score from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.